The new podcast, In the Shadow of Princeton, starts as the matriarch of a prominent Princeton family is found stabbed to death in her locked basement. Investigators look from a serial attacker to her family to Princeton University students. One hot-blooded investigator sees a conspiracy. Is he way off base, or does privilege let you get away with murder? In the Shadow of Princeton is available wherever you get podcasts, or you can binge it ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Ducks Confidential Podcast. I'm James Crepia, joined as always by Ryan Clark, and we'll be going over yet another Oregon win. This one, a 38-17 edition from the Big House, and a impressive win insofar as areas that Oregon was dominant in, particularly in the run game on both sides of the ball. Would not necessarily make much of it in the passing game because while Dylan Gabriel had a very nice day, it was against one that was a bad pass defense in the first place that was made even worse without having its top two cornerbacks in the game. So, frankly, the context is relevant there. But ultimately, a game that I think people will, in the big picture, in the long run, it's going to be looked at as a 3-score win, and you move on against a team who could end up being 6-6 or potentially worse. So not much to be overstated about. However, in the more short run, particularly immediately thereafter, Anthony, you can look at it and say it could have been better because, well, if not for a couple of 3-and-outs and a fumbled punt, particularly the fumbled punt early, Oregon could have dominated even more. Conversely, you say it also could have been worse because, there was that fumbled punt, and now Michigan did capitalize on that and led the points. But how about in the second half where you've got a 3-score lead and Michigan comes up with a stop and gets a score and comes up with another stop? And if not for their own incompetence in terms of committing a penalty on a punt that was just inexplicable, and then Oregon gets 3 points out of that, Michigan had momentum at that point, and they could have gotten within a score, and they could have gotten with a score again late, if not for a nice red zone stop. So really, on both sides, you could say, the optimist and the Ducks fan wants to say, well, they could have, would have, should have won by even more than they did, even in covering and a 3-score win. Other side, yeah, and it also could have been a 1-score game in the last couple of minutes, and you could have been biting your fingernails off against a team who you were absolutely better than in every way. So, frankly, in a 3-score win, like I say, even in the short term, you just kind of chalk it up as, hey, you know what? The other team's allowed to try too, and even if they're not very good, and you still won by 3 scores. So in a place that's not easy to play in, even if it's not the kind of season that's going to keep a crowd like that engaged throughout, and it wasn't, as Ryan can affirm. There were people clearing out, including from the student section, by halftime. So it was not exactly the most daunting of 100,000-person venues, and it rarely is. But it's still not easy to play there. And it's not like everybody comes on in and wins. Texas did it earlier in the year. They're a really good team. But it's a tough place to play. It's a tough place to win. And Oregon went in and basically dominated the game. Yeah, and,
there are for sure things to nitpick out of it, and there are things to I think, rightly analyze and look at in the phrase that Dan Lanning used, try to attack, as they like to say. The third quarter is the obvious one, right? Everybody has pointed out the lack of touchdown in the last 6 third quarters, which I don't think it's the same situation in every game, but there is a commonality of Oregon having such a great first half, particularly these last 2 weeks, that the third quarter is one where they can sort of slow it down a little bit. I don't think they're necessarily trying to do that. I don't think Will Stein is packing it in and limiting the playbook fully. But it is a trend to look at. It is something to think about when you're in a more competitive game against better teams than Oregon's been playing. You go back to the Ohio State game, it was tight at the half, and it just remained tight the rest of the way, and Oregon pulled it out. So, there's your example of it being okay in that regard. But overall, obviously, the Oregon offensive line is one of the biggest things that stood out to me from this game, just given the nature of who they were going against, the quality of guys in that front seven, for Gabriel to not suffer a sack, partly due to his legs and his ability to escape, but in large part due to his protection and his ability to have time to get the ball to his playmakers. That's a massive point of growth for this Oregon team when this was such a huge point of criticism in the early part of the season, playing Boise State, Idaho, everybody else. It was a major problem. And then, defensively, Oregon didn't have as tall of a task defensively as they've had in previous games. They played a team in Michigan that's very limited, that focuses heavily on the run. I think there was a goal line play where there weren't even any corners in the game for the Ducks at one point, and they got the stop. It was Tysheem Johnson and Kobe Savage on the edges. But I think of solid effort in the third quarter by Michigan to sort of try and get back into it, and credit to them for getting the ball downfield as they did and finding some soft spots in the middle of the Oregon defense. Certainly Oregon would like to have been better in the third quarter and not allowed them to sort of creep back into semi-competitive territory, but they slammed the door shut at the end. They marched the ball down the field to make it a 3-score game after Michigan failed on fourth down. And, they did what they needed to do. It was a workmanlike performance, and one that, continued to solidify them as the best team in the country. But there are certainly things here and there to examine and to try and parse out of a game like that, for sure.
Yeah. There are some. I think there are more positives than negatives out of it, in terms of even things that people want to really harp on or get after. I just don't see, especially offensively speaking, other than this third quarter thing, which to me, this was the first game of this stretch that it really felt like it truly mattered.
Yeah.
In all the other instances, I honestly thought it was a trend that was being made out to be something that it really wasn't, or that it really didn't matter all that much.
Yeah, or in some ways was coincidence in some frankly, respects. Yeah,
some of it was just bizarre coincidence. Some of it was who cares. In several of these instances, whereas, all right, look, in some in some other spot, for instance, all right, what do you do with the touchdown that they get at Purdue, where the drive started at the end of the third quarter, but the score came early in the fourth quarter? Well, what do you call that? Where you have a missed field goal. So, what do you call a drive that spans quarters? So, like I said, there's some quirks there where I just didn't think it was as big a deal as it was being made to be. However, all right, it was a trend. And, again, it didn't necessarily have any consequence in some of the other games. This was one where it felt like it absolutely was having an impact in real time, and could have had a bigger one, because if the 3 points that they did get was on a drive that was extended because of lining up over the center on an unusual formation on punt.
Yeah, and folks talking about that formation online too, as when we didn't get a chance to ask Dan about it post game, but as something that they seemingly did intentionally, knowing that they would get somebody lined up in front of the center there illegally. Another
it's
quote unquote savvy. Yeah, it's out
coaching because Michigan committed a penalty.
Right.
You can't absolutely know. There is no way to absolutely know that you're going to get the other team to play along. I'm sorry, you can't. There's no way to know that. You can think that you might be able to draw a penalty because it is unusual. You can absolutely think that. And for whatever you may have seen on film that might indicate that you might be able to draw it, especially being, the rule. Sure. But you can't know for certain, because all it takes is the player himself to just, not line up over the center. I mean, like it's not a genius level situation. There was no, if he literally moves a yard either way or just doesn't bother going, straight up at the center because there's no one else there. It's just not that level. Like, yes, it's a out coaching moment because ultimately Michigan's players are put in that position where they don't know what they're doing / unprepared. That's on coaching. But the idea that the other team is going to do something, so like there's no way to absolutely definitively know that the defense is going to do that.
Sure, they gave themselves a chance in that situation, though.
Yeah,
and the other aspect of it is there were multiple sort of moments where, like on the coaching side, Michigan made some mistakes in this game. I mean, the challenge, just basically not knowing the rule, basically is what the broadcast said.
Absolutely absurd.
That was pretty insane. And so for Dan Lanning to come into the big house and have a couple of those moments, and he had nothing to do, of course, with the challenge, but to win the coaching battle is
on either one, on the one that on the challenge that wasn't on the fact that there was no review of the first touchdown. I mean, that's just frankly that's fortuitous for Lanning and Oregon's purposes.
Certainly, yeah, very fortuitous. And Michigan fans would be the first to point that out for sure.
I honestly thought that Sharon Moore got talked into the challenge by his players. I really do. I thought it happened in real time because I was watching. Donovan Edwards absolutely was losing his mind.
Yeah, he was very upset.
I honestly thought he was going to get an unsportsmanlike because he was so irate, and it was towards the official on the sideline. I thought he was going to get flagged because you don't know who knows what was being said, but it was so directed at the official and it was so animated that I went. I'm watching it going like I'm making sure who this is because was it a player? I didn't know if it was a defender at first because I'm just going like I'm just seeing this player just completely blow his top. I'm going like, were they involved in the play? No, they just watched the play. All right, fine, but they were so animated. I'm going. Are they going to get a penalty and then this really gets rendered moot? First off, but second off, then the challenge comes. I'm going. I think it's because his guys are. I appreciate that a team's trying to fight and come up with a play there, but there was nothing about it. Nothing. Even in real time. I get if you're on the team, you think everything is going your way or whatever, but there was nothing about that catch that made you think, oh, yeah, that was complete. Nothing. He credit to Loveland insofar as that he very nearly makes a play, but he didn't.
And he had a great game, too. That's another thing. Like, amid all their incompetence in throwing the football, like, he proved himself to be their lone target. And, that's another point of minor criticism, I think, on the part of the Oregon defense, is there were moments where, like, hey, that is literally the only guy you have to cover out there. And he was sort of tearing them up a little bit in the third quarter. And
a couple of them were on zones where you can't necessarily, like, oh, well, he just flat out beat this guy or this guy was out of position or... Right. No, look, some of it just ultimately you tip your cap, and the other part is calling it what it is. You're no tight end, none, zero. There is not a tight end in the country who is going to single-handedly beat you. So, yeah, he is their top target, and yeah, he had over 100 yards. Granted, the majority of it I think came on 2 or 3 plays, but be that as it may, yeah. And it led to nothing.
Right.
It meant he didn't score. So, and now granted, yes, they came up with the 2 touchdowns. I will say the 1 touchdown throw was actually pretty nice to Morris there in the end zone. But bottom line, look, the things to go after to me in this one to really be more, I would say, almost critical of are really, really finite. Because, again, passing-wise, like you mentioned, Ryan, you don't allow a sack. You allow 3 TFLs for a total loss of 5 yards. Basically meaningless. You go 10 of 15 on third down. And you did most of that damage through the air. Gabriel avoids some pressure, but the line really was bordering on excellent against a defensive front that, from a talent standpoint, is probably the most talented they're going to play, not just in terms of the regular season, probably the most talented they're going to play all season. No matter who they play in the playoff, it is probably the most talented. That's how good those guys are. You have a 100-yard rusher, 176 with 4 touchdowns as a team on the ground against a top 15 run defense, even if they're a bit of a paper tiger insofar as some of the stats, because they're starting to shift accordingly the other way. Fine. You lose your most productive receiver and your third or fourth receiver, depending on who you want to go by, has a 100-yard game and a career night against a team that hadn't allowed a 100-yard receiver, even for as bad a pass defense as it was. Those are the positives. You outcoach them with the punt. The defense was better tackling. You hold them to, up until the very end, right around 100 yards rushing, just over 105. And if you take, I'm not saying if you take away, I mean, you always take away the best plays, for sure, but putting aside 2 runs for 44 yards, you have 61 yards on the ground allowed on 26 other carries. I mean, there's not a coordinator in the country who wouldn't take that under almost any circumstance, but most especially against a one-dimensional running a game like Michigan, and you're on the road. So, to me, those are all the things that are the main overarching takeaways of the game as a whole. And like I say, they're overwhelmingly all positive.
Yeah.
And you don't have to bend over backwards to make them that way. The things that are critical, I say, I don't think there's really all that many, other than, just this third quarter trend is a trend, no doubt about it. And this was the first time it really felt like it could be an issue. And all right, Loveland got over 100. Outside of that, I just don't see a lot there to really harp on of like, man, they failed here. Now, I mean, there's nothing to criticize by way of injuries. You get 2 guys back and you have 2 others go down, and you hope that both Tez and Marcus Harper, that their injuries are not in any way even somewhat long term. You hope, Tez has certainly looked more significant just because he's wearing a sling, whereas Harper was wrapped up and had some ice and was limping pretty good. But according to Dan, told him after the game he'd be all right. But what does that mean? Hopefully we'll
what does all right mean for any offensive lineman?
Exactly.
These guys have fingers turned 90 degrees, and they're just
how many guys have played with? I mean, I'm pretty sure Alex Forsythe at different times played with multiple broken fingers. But be that as, I know Stephen Jones did at one point. So anywho, all to say, I think as the game as a whole, the score, things within it, overwhelmingly, both sides, really, all 3 phases of the game, bordered on dominant or were dominant, and the main 1, 2, 3 takeaways in any one way were all positive. I'd say truly the biggest negative to me would be on the fumbled punt of, hey, I won't even blame Ryan Pelham, to be honest with you. Not entirely. Because you are still talking about a true freshman in an awfully big spot that, he has to go out there. He's the next guy. Oh, he practices it, this, that, the other. All right. You be 18 and run out there at the big house under the circumstance. All right. I'm just saying, like, is he one of the guys who goes through punt return every single day in practice? Yeah, he is. And Gary Bryant's not available. So you've got a finite number of guys. You know who I would have put back there? Evan Stewart.
And then they did.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I would have done it for the first one. And why not? Because I would have even wanted a return. I just want an older guy, been there, done that, who can catch a football, and to where I have zero concern about it.
Yeah, and your offense has been so unbelievably productive that, yes, you got a punt return touchdown from Tez earlier this year, but, like, in reality, wave your hand and catch the ball, and your offense is going to produce the way that it has. That's another piece of it. And, like, losing Tez, and if it is serious, and hopefully it isn't for his sake, because he's such an unbelievable competitor and a great guy and somebody that we've gotten to know so well. And it would obviously be a massive loss for Oregon. But, if it is, I think that, or if it is serious, I think Oregon fans can be heartened by the fact that, all those different guys stepped up by way of playmaking, and there really was no visible drop off in any respect for the Oregon offense by way of production. You saw what Trayshawn Holden did. He had a big game. Evan Stewart, he was a penalty away from touchdown catch of the year territory and was still one of the highlights of the season despite it getting called back for illegal man downfield. And he's been great the last few games removed from that play. Justice Lowe has come in and been a really reliable player, particularly on some of those, dink and dunk type plays that you've seen Tez Johnson have success on. Now, he's not the same player as Tez, but he's put himself in those type of positions. And you've got other guys like Kenyon Sadiq, who has had a tremendous few games in replacing Terrence Ferguson, and now Ferg's back healthy as well. They the depth and the volume of weapons that this team has is frankly unparalleled in the country, and that it bodes very well for an Oregon team, even if they don't have a guy that was on pace to break the Oregon receptions records for this season. They are in a very good position by way of roster construction and depth to be able to weather this sort of thing. And hey, if you want to look at a positive, should this go that way, talk about a motivator, man. Talk about if you're looking for another edge, which I don't think this Oregon team needs one right now, but if you're looking for another one, you go into the postseason down a guy that is a central figure in the locker room. That's one heck of a motivator.
I think the depth will be tested significantly in the not too distant future. Because, all right, forget about Maryland. They're not. We're not going to be talking about them a whole lot this week. We'll leave it for the recap. They're a team that entering the season, I thought of any of the games on Oregon's schedule, I thought Maryland could. I didn't know if there was. I didn't really think there was much of a trap game on the schedule, but I thought if there was one, that it might be Maryland because of circumstance, because of coaching, because of familiarity, because it's between two road trips, because of any number of factors. I don't believe that one iota anymore. Yeah, they got a nice win over SC a couple weeks ago, but now I'm not even sure what that means because So be that all as it may, I don't think it's going to be much of a test from Maryland necessarily this week. I say in the not too distant future because even grossly overmatched teams, whether it be Maryland or Wisconsin, quite frankly, I think some of these areas could be tested significantly because if Tez is out for even a week or even 2 weeks, let alone if it's longer. If you're an opposing defense, now you really double team Evan Stewart. Go ahead. That's not to say that Trayshawn or Justice or Sadiq can't be effective. Let's say if you're an opposing defensive coordinator, especially if you're, again, an opponent with any talent and the ability to actually compete with Oregon, particularly when you're talking about a potential rematch with Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. Or theoretically Indiana, because we can't rule that out nowadays. That is still on the table.
9-Windiana is here, and then they're going for 10-Windiana next week against these Michigan Wolverines.
So, well, I think we can chalk that one up accordingly for the moment, and look ahead to the matchup with them in Ohio State to determine who will probably be playing Oregon in Indianapolis. If you're the coordinator for either one of those teams, if Tez Johnson isn't on the field, you're double teaming Evan Stewart and saying, all right, can your Heisman contender quarterback and everybody else beat us? Can they hang? We'll find out. It's not to say the answer is absolutely no, but if you're the opposing D coordinator, especially if you're Jim Knowles and it's a rematch with Ohio State, you're going to put two bodies on Stewart and say, all right, let's see. Let's see what happens on the other side. Now, with Ferguson back, that adds a very, 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 very important piece, not just to the Oregon offense, but to the Oregon offense that has to then counter that kind of approach if Tez is out. Because you have to be able to attack the middle of the field a little bit to prevent that and draw safety away from potential double teams of Stewart specifically. And if you can throw them on the same side of the field, then you can really do some damage. And it allows for, if you can put Ferguson and Sadiq together, which they did obviously quite a bit this past week in the first place, and had done a little bit before Ferguson got hurt, because you can line up Sadiq as a true receiver, more so than they have even with Ferguson at times, you can at least try to bridge the gap there. Because here's the thing, like I say, with depth, yeah, on one hand, can they get by? Yeah, against a team without its top two corners, or Maryland, or Wisconsin, or probably even Washington. Yeah. Where you're going to have a harder time is up against teams who have better talent. And the teams in the games that are going to matter the most if it gets to those points. And not to say nothing of, you're one rolled ankle away then from, all right, then who's coming on the field? Because Bryant's not available, because Casper is out. And you start going down the list and it becomes, yeah, now you're down to the freshmen. And that's not saying anything bad about them. It's saying now you're asking true freshmen who have played in limited circumstances to now be not just on the field and going through the motions in a 3 or 4 score football game. No, you're asking them to come through in playoff situations. That's where, depth is going to be tested significantly in the weeks ahead if Tez is unable to play, even again, whether it be a game, 2 games, or longer. It could become an issue. Harper, you saw it for certainly those who want to pounce on any one player comes in and then the next play. I mean, you got to be kidding. It was 3rd and 13. Kavika Rogers steps in. Hey, somebody had to. And he's only the most experienced next lineman in terms of both career and snaps on the season.
And it's not like he was the first player to give up pressure to Gabriel in that game either. I mean, the offensive line played great, but geez, that is like, hey, good luck, Kawika, like getting out there and trying to stop those guys.
Yeah. So as a whole, again, we'll see in terms of with Harper what the impact is to this week and how quickly he comes back and those things as well. If he is out for any period of time, what the shakeout there is there. Quite frankly, yeah, it could be Kavika because he was the next man up in this situation. It could be Janoris Wilson, who we had seen be the next man up in other capacities. So can't rule it out. And yeah, it could be Dave Iuli, who has been available the past 2 weeks. He wasn't even listed as questionable this week. So he went through warmups. He's been in full pads. He traveled this past week. All right, he's clearly nearing a return. He's redshirting, but he can still play. So that's of no concern. When he will get a chance to play and potentially debut and the like, sure. Again, I would rule out Bedford for people for myriad reasons. One, he's not even practicing, so you can really rule it out. And 2, even if he were, I believe that for Bedford specifically, as well as Michael Gardner, who's been out the whole season, that Bedford, since he redshirted specifically, because with Gardner, and also had already redshirted, but if you're looking for a medical hardship waiver for another year of eligibility, I believe you can't come back and play deep into the season. Whether you have a 4-game redshirt applicability or not, that's off the table. But again, it's a moot point for Bedford because he's not even practicing. It's totally moot. So who would be the next man up in a situation where they have the opportunity to prepare for it more than just an in-game substitution situation? Yeah, you're probably looking at either Kavika Rogers or Wilson, or as I say, if Iuli is ready to go and can be in that position from a game prep standpoint, then yeah, So it's not lack of options,
right?
But it's
you
lack of a lot of experience by way of options because, you always played before, but again, hadn't played now in almost a year.
Yeah, and you don't want to take any matchup for granted, and they wouldn't, but if there ever was one, to be a little extra cautious with a guy like Harper, who is so integral to what you do on the offensive line, to maybe give him some rest when he doesn't necessarily need it, by way of recovery. I mean, this Maryland game is definitely the one of the final three to do that, right? I mean, it would be a solid one to give him a little extra rest ahead of a trip to Wisconsin, where, I mean, shoot, that Wisconsin team, not to look too far ahead as we, obviously still have the Maryland game. Not much to preview there, but certainly it's on the docket. That Wisconsin team gave up 42 points to Iowa, man. Like that's going to be a cool trip to go to Camp Randall. Always a crazy atmosphere. I look forward to being there. But that might not be even as close as the Michigan game. It could be demonstrably worse. So that's a topic for next week. But in terms of Harper, there's a window here where you could give him a little extra if he needs a little extra.
Yeah, I think the only thing that'll make Camp Randall a particularly daunting situation would be if the game, and we'll find out shortly, but if the game were in the evening and people have an opportunity to position themselves accordingly for a later in the day.
Some performance enhancement, perhaps.
But from the always late arriving crowd at Camp Randall. But other than that, I don't imagine that this is not a Wisconsin team of yore. But again, that's down the road. Insofar as a initial look at Maryland, such as it is, and I say that because unfortunately for them, they just do not have much to hang their hat on right now. I mean, they're a 4-4 team. They're coming off a bye. That was part of why I, again, back in July, said if there's a trap game, one of the teams coming off a bye before playing Oregon. Maryland's 4 wins are against Connecticut, who, yes, is now a bowl-eligible team, but, I mean, come on. Virginia, Villanova, and what is increasingly a mediocre USC team. And its losses are to Michigan State, Indiana, which they were actually bordering unserviceable in that game, Northwestern, badly, and Minnesota. This is not a very good football team. And there's just no particular way around it. Now, their run defense is quite solid. I'll give them that. That's probably the one area that, okay, that's something to pay attention to. That's something of note entering it. That for a team that's as rough around the edges as Maryland is, that, all right, that's something where, yeah, you can legitimately say they're actually pretty good there. They are. They have a productive lead receiver in Ty Felton, who's at over 900 yards receiving. And they have a couple of defensive players who've been disruptive. A couple. Nobody who's just absolutely jumping off the page, but a couple. But overall, this is yet another one of those examples of an opponent who Oregon is vastly, vastly more talented than. And should be able to dominate in quite literally every phase of the game. So, yes, it is a 4-score betting line for a reason. I don't imagine that this is going to be terribly competitive for all that long. And again, I'm the one who was saying back in July that I thought if there was a trap game on the schedule, and I really didn't think there was one. But of all the circumstances, I'm sorry, I did not think the trip to West Lafayette was going to be where they got tripped up, no matter what Purdue was historically in some of those settings. This was not the year for that. Yeah, I thought Maryland could have been that team. Could have been. Because it was between road trips for Oregon, because they were coming off a bye, because of coaching familiarity insofar as Loxley very much knowing and having spent time in Tuscaloosa with Tosh, I believe also with Dan, or if they didn't cross over, that he certainly is quite friendly with Dan. But that ultimately, I did not think that there was much of a challenge necessarily, but I thought if there was any team at all that was going to be the quote-unquote trap game, that this might have been it. No. I'm sorry. I retract any previous allusion to such, because they're, as I say, they're just not a very good football team right now.
And Oregon is a great football team. This is a team that has had a remarkable season, that has massive aspirations, that has yet to show in the last 7 weeks or 8 weeks any inkling of slippage, any real inkling of weakness, frankly. And so to their credit and to Dan Lanning's credit, this is a team that has yet to sort of lay an egg against a lesser team in this Big Ten play. And that doesn't mean that they are impervious to doing so. Certainly national championship caliber teams have done that before, but I just don't see it happening here. I could see it being weirdly close on the road at Wisconsin for a bit before they blow it open, but not against Maryland, not at home in the environment that Autzen is going to be, regardless of the opponent. This is going to be, I think, a pretty lopsided affair.
And we'll certainly get into that one more next week by way of a recap, where I imagine that recap may also be relatively brief, because if it does live up to what it's shaping up to be, I don't think there'll be much for us to get into. We'll chat briefly before wrapping up here ahead of the first college football playoff rankings to come out Tuesday evening. So set your DVRs accordingly, set your outrage reminders accordingly, because even as the presumptive runaway favorite to be number one each week, until and unless circumstances dictate a change there, somehow I'm sure people will find a way to be aggrieved. But
by far the biggest thing happening on Tuesday too.
I mean, I know nothing else that could be comparable. So, look, again, watch and torture yourselves accordingly with the playoff ranking television show that is. Just know that you're very much helping the Walt Disney Company with that, because that's really the only reason why this is part of it. It's just they need to get those quarter hourly ratings to be part of it, and to play a part in their promotion of college basketball that they spend 5 seconds on. So with that, which we'll actually probably touch on a little bit more of that here briefly as the season does begin, after all. Outside of the obvious that Oregon absolutely should be, and I'd be mystified if they weren't, number one in the initial CFP rankings Tuesday night. I'm not sure that outside of where the polls are at right now, at least at the top, I'm not sure there's going to be any truly massive surprise by way of where the committee will have somebody who is in that top 10, top 15 in the polls that the committee will have either way ahead or way behind. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the committee will necessarily think terribly highly of Indiana or BYU because of the strength of schedule right now. But that said, the polls are kind of holding them to, relatively speaking, right around that same kind of standard, quite honestly. Indiana's 8 in the AP and 10 in the coaches, and BYU's 9 in both. And honestly, I kind of think that's about right. In terms of the teams toward the top, I could see where the committee, if they're putting out between true ranking versus what the bracket would be as of today, if they're going by true ranking, I could see where the committee might have Miami a peg or two lower because of strength of schedule right now. Now, again, based on where the bracket would be, because there's an ACC champion and whatever, that's different. But by strength of schedule and strength of victory so far, I could see him by true seeding if the committee came out and said, yeah, sorry, no, Texas and even Penn State and maybe even Tennessee are all ahead because, yeah, Miami's undefeated, and they may think the world of Cam Ward and any number of other things, but they just don't have any truly massive wins by way of presently ranked teams. I could see something like that. But outside of somebody, like I say, in a circumstance like that, or again, Indiana and BYU aren't that highly ranked in the polls as it is relative to other undefeateds. Maybe Alabama, maybe. But even that, because they have 2 losses, I'm not sure that's going to be where they suddenly try to cause a momentary headache for themselves by artificially putting Alabama ahead of who? Ahead of an undefeated Indiana or BYU? I don't see that. So if you're going to have a team ahead of somebody else, like, all right, who's that somebody kind of thing? Again, maybe Boise? Maybe?
Yeah, I think Boise is a kind of wild card in there, especially if obviously BYU loses, but also if Miami does.
Eventually, but I'm talking more on Tuesday night as of now, where there's still these undefeated teams in the playoff committee's initial rankings. What are they going to say, and what does that outlook even mean 4, 5, 6 weeks from now? I think it will largely fall in line with, and really it then becomes the reverse, that once the committee rankings come out, that the polls start to fall in line with the committee. Yeah, but here, I'm not sure there's going to be a massive deviation. Like I say, outside of if they want to get into the true seed versus what the bracket would look like. If you want to get into, that's where I could see Miami being lower by true seed, but ultimately
I would imagine they're going to
whatever.
Structure it just by not only trying to keep consistency, but also for explanation purposes, for people to fully understand and come to terms with those top 4 seeds are going to be the top 4 conference champions. Like, no matter how potentially rage-inducing it could be, should an undefeated Oregon team go to Indianapolis and lose to an Ohio State and end up as, in that scenario, likely the 5 seed and have to play an additional game, this is how it's structured. And there are other teams for whom that sort of frustrating route, despite an incredible season, could play out. But you also, in addition to trying to maintain consistency and showcase your ability to put these rankings together, you also have to sort of explain it to the general public in a way that is at the very least palatable for now until they have a reason to rage about it later.
Well, I'll let that be part of the task of the 2,000 talking heads that ESPN will have on a weekly basis. But and ultimately, in that supposed doomsday scenario, the other part of it, and again, not on a week to week. Again, we'll get this way. We got a month to harp on this stuff.
A lot of football left.
But under that doomsday scenario, the thing that the committee also has to look to avoid, in the end, I don't care about any of the Tuesdays. To me, this exercise is bordering on the absurd insofar as that it really shouldn't be a thing. And I said that before they even went to the 14 playoff. I was among the chorus of people who said, they raised questions to Bill Hancock and others at the time saying, why do this? You don't have to do this. You could just come out with the final and avoid the headache. Well, it's a tradition. Okay, and the only way traditions become traditions, the only way traditions become traditions. Yeah, I was going to say it's because ESPN wants a weekly television show, but other than that,
it's the TV ratings, it's the advertising that goes with the show.
Right.
I mean, that's just that's so funny
that's why I said you just come out and say that. At least that I would respect. But all right, but point is, the one thing they need to look to avoid, especially at the end, is that whoever the 5 seed is, whether that be the Big Ten or SEC championship game loser, whoever that is, that because everyone is automatically chalking up the 12 as whoever is the G5 champion, and at the moment that looks like Boise State, I'm not automatically chalking that up as they're going to be the 12.
And if they finish without more than one loss, they shouldn't be. They should be like 7, 8, 9 range at the lowest.
I don't know if they'll necessarily host a playoff game, but be that because
there's a
they still have a
chance.
strength of schedule. They still have a strength of schedule factor in there where I'm not sure that they're going to have the battery of opponents to necessarily justify that. But ultimately, you don't want the 5 seed, especially if the 12 is indeed the G5 champion, even if it's the G5 champion with a Heisman Trophy winning running back. You don't want the perception to be that having lost your conference championship game as the 5, that you have the easier path than the 1 seed. Because you can say, well, you had to play an extra game. Yeah, but if the 1 extra game is against a pincushion, because right now we're all chalking it up to Boise State, Nash, and Genty, but say it's not. Say that they trip up and lose somewhere, and then it's a lesser team. We're not even say it's Army, frankly. Can't rule it out. So, all right, say something like that happens. All right, now the 5 has a quote unquote a home game under a, albeit what is going to be perceived as very easy circumstance. Then they're going to play the 4 seed, who right now everybody's chalking up to be the Big 12 champion, BYU, Iowa State, maybe Colorado even. All right, so now you have to play 2 games, but depending on who that 5 seed is. Big deal. And the 1 seed, even though they avoided the first round with it, the opportunity to host a playoff game, they had to play the winner of the 8-9, which, again, by the time it matters, I'm not going by 8-9 today because Indiana may not be undefeated by then. BYU may not have been defeated by then. And even if they are, they're going to be a top 4 seed. And so then who are we talking about? Whoever that is, the perception will be that the neutral site matchup with the 8-9 winner will be more difficult for the 1 than a juggernaut 5 beating a bad 12 and a bad 4. And that's the perception and part of this, that when we get to the point that it actually matters a month from now, that the committee is going to have to take into account when seeding the bracket. Because if they... Yeah, again, this year will be, obviously it's the first one and the one that everybody will overanalyze, but to say nothing of, yes, think of how it would apply in past years where whether it's the Big Ten championship game loser, the SEC championship game loser, if they go in with, if you have those years where Bama and Georgia are undefeated, so you've got a 12-1 just powerhouse sitting there. Heck, even this year, say Oregon beats Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. So you've got a 11-2, $20 million roster Ohio State with that receiving core taking on whoever the 12 is at Columbus on December 21st. And then whoever the Big 12 champion is and however many losses they may have in the Fiesta Bowl, which if you're Ohio State, you're going to have more people there because of your fan base, and your retirees already exist in Arizona, which is basically the second home for the postseason for Ohio State.
Yeah, they love it there.
And I mean, there's literally Buckeye Road, and then literally by the airport. Then you have, now that you got through those 2 quote unquote tests, congratulations, now you're in the semifinal, and you're playing presumably the 1 if they survive against the 8-9, or you're getting the 8-9.
Yeah.
You want to avoid the perception and the view as a committee as you're drawing this final, when you get to the final bracket to where it matters. Forget about on the week to week, because that is just going to be a mind-numbing experience for us all. Because, like I say, so much of it is absurd. All right, so when they come out with this first one, even if they just go by true seeding, all right, so Oregon, Georgia, Miami, and BYU. All right, that's the top 4 because of the champions. All right, now we have to go to the 5 and et cetera, et cetera. Well, are you chalking up by true seeding? You're going to say Ohio State's the 5. Meanwhile, Indiana's sitting there undefeated right now, saying, all right, we are where we are in the polls, but even the committee hates us and we're undefeated. And this is what part of why I think this exercise is so ridiculous, because
the week-to-week debate culture thing that comes out of it, that you're parsing things that just are unsettled.
If only they just did this one time before the conference championship games, once the majority of the country's regular seasons were over, and then right after. But no, again,
and I think the structure of it is inherently flawed. I think that it would be better served, and this is my opinion, I think it would be better served if they just had a top four, regardless of conference champion status. They still had the five highest rated conference champions get an automatic bid in general. But I honestly think the seeding should just be the seeding, man. It's crazy to me to imagine an undefeated or even one loss BYU team having a potential advantage over this Oregon team should they slip up against Ohio State in that Big Ten championship, because then this is why they do this. Of course, this is why they do the week-to-week thing, is so that people like us and people that are fans and people on Twitter will yell at each other and debate and whatever. But it just, like, in terms of structure, like, you had a problem before and you created, I think, a couple more potential problems when you have the 12-team playoff be structured the way that it is. I don't know. I personally think that top four is top four, should be top four, regardless.
Some of this is going to shake out regardless, because, for one, right now it's the perception of BYU today.
Yeah.
All right. Tease it out for a second. Ohio State beats Indiana. Georgia beats Tennessee. All right, so now BYU is 7th. All right, so now Oregon beats Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. So now they're a 2-loss team, so BYU is 6th. So like I say, the outrage meter of true seeding, by the time it actually matters, and by the time you get there, if everything holds true and everything plays out a certain kind of way, it's not going to be as outrageous as it might look in November the 5th by way of ranking and seeding and the way things stand at the moment. To say nothing of other potential upsets or other things thrown in there. Yeah, in a year where one of the Power Four leagues has a truly weak champion, well, yeah. Well, I think we used to call that the Pac-12, which is why in the 14 playoff it hardly ever made it, because they were written off and dismissed. In a 12-team format, one, that'll never happen for the Power Four leagues, but I shouldn't say that. As long as there's still a Power Four, that won't ever happen. But, man, I say perception will get there and shift as more of these games play out. And like I say, some of these, where more losses are going to pile up. There's are. That's part of why I think the exercise is ridiculous to go through for 5 or 6 solid weeks, because one, there's no lasting power. It is just a week-to-week look. And two, then when you get to the real end of things, obviously last year you saw exactly how flawed that system got with everything with Florida State and the perception issue that became at the very, very end, because they put out rankings accordingly, but then the self-constructed narrative that was led by ESPN about impact of quarterback health and those things that suddenly shifted late, right, wrong, or otherwise. Here, and we'll see what it looks like. I would, again, hardly going out on a limb, I think we can chalk up Oregon as the 1 seed and the number 1 in the initial rankings. I don't think we have to wait until Tuesday night to hear that. What the rest of it looks like, and what I think we'll learn in this initial go around is just how the committee will be presenting it on a week-to-week basis and trying to tell folks, will they be truly going through true seeds, true ranking, and then, oh yeah, by the way, this is what the bracket would look like because of the bracket construct, or will they just be putting out the bracket and not necessarily getting into the true seeding? I hope it's the former. Because to me, you still have to come out with the full top 25. So I don't know what are you going to do? Well, say here's 13 through 25, but the top 12, we're just going to show you the bracket. They're the quote unquote seeding of where we may have had some of these teams is a mystery. Now, I think you just got to put out 1 through 25 and then say, and based on that, this is what the bracket would look like. I hope that's the way it is. But we'll get into all that, like I say, more on a week-to-week basis. And touching on it ever so briefly, oh yeah, by the way, the college basketball season is upon us. And yes, Oregon, along with everybody else across the country, starting the season Monday evening with a doubleheader. So Ryan will be at Matthew Knight Arena for the women's game to start things off accordingly. That will be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with Cal Baptist, and I will be there later in the evening for the men against UC Riverside. Not much to get into by way of game previews here. Obviously, season openers, non-conference games accordingly. Obviously, the Ducks expected to win on both fronts. But touch on briefly for folks, Ryan, who have not necessarily been following every piece of minutia, a vastly different women's basketball roster from a year ago. And having said that, also a women's basketball roster that is dealing with some health issues of its own, where, all right, it may not necessarily come into play that much against Cal Baptist in terms of being an impact on the outcome, but something that even in non-conference play, where they have a couple of legitimate non-conference opponents here, whether they be home, road, or neutral site, that this is these health issues that they do have may be becoming a bigger issue in the games ahead, if maybe not in the season opener. Yeah,
look, this is a completely different Oregon women's basketball team this year. Everybody who followed this team knows that last season was brutal, to put it mildly, for Oregon. They lost 14 consecutive games to end the season. There were questions about whether, Kelly Graves would return to the school. Now, whether those questions existed solely on the outside, or if there was in fact consideration on the part of the school, or even Graves, who has seen colleagues, step away, people like Tara Vanderveer retire. Was there that consideration? Who knows? It's irrelevant now, because Oregon has completely turned the page on that season and is fully focused on this year with 9 newcomers on this roster. That includes 7 transfers and 2 incoming freshmen who the team are excited about. The couple that come to mind in terms of the transfers are Deja Kelly, a guard who played for North Carolina for several years and is slated to more than likely be the star player for this Oregon team. And Amina Muhammad, the cousin of Jabbar Muhammad from the football team. She comes in by way of Texas. She's a, scrappy, like, long-armed forward who is someone that can, be a presence in terms of rebounding and slashing to the basket for Oregon. They like the freshmen that they're bringing in Katie Fiso and Ahis Faith Atute. Both of those players, Kelly Graves has said, have been real standouts in preseason. So a mix of veteran experience. Obviously, you have Filipina Shea back as one of the players from last season, but the 6'8" center, she's injured to start the year with a leg issue, and the timeline is TBD on her return. So you're missing somebody that could lead the country in rebounding, and is really the only true player of significant size on this Oregon team. So how do they make up for that? How do they navigate this early season, this non-conference schedule that includes Baylor coming into Eugene this coming Sunday, and then Auburn down the road, and a couple other solid opponents in this non-conference? Thankfully, all at home except for a trip to Hawaii. How do they navigate that? They believe that they're a pretty scrappy team, that they play hard, that they play for each other. And those are superlatives. Those are things that a lot of teams are going to say about themselves. But, being around this Oregon team at practice, getting a feel for the general vibe entering the season, it seems like this is a group that is going to take some time to mend together, or to meld together, I should say, but is certainly a big difference by way of energy and effort from last year, which Kelly Graves even admitted was a team that not only lacked experience but lacked talent and just had a really rough go. So this is a new year for the Ducks. They obviously enter a Big Ten that has a ton of really good teams. I think they're conference schedule's got 8 ranked teams on it, so that is no small task. But it's going to be an interesting year, I think, for Oregon, and I think that they believe that they can, once healthy, and if they can put the pieces together and make some noise in sort of the middle or upper middle tier of the Big Ten, they think that they have a shot at making the NCAA tournament, and that would be a pretty significant turnaround from last year, no doubt.
Time will tell. We heard this last year insofar as scrap, grit, and toughness, and saw exactly zero of it. So now, granted, part of injuries played a little bit of a factor there, but not that big a factor. I'm always a little bit reluctant to hear that a team that basically is not exactly known for its defense, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be the hallmark. You can be okay on defense without being, the identity of a team. I think it's still going to be based on offense, but I'm just always a little reluctant to hear about a team who's not exactly known for something. Suddenly that's going to be the thing when it has never been the thing, and when it was so very much not the thing. Now, there's only one direction to go in some areas on the defense, particularly in terms of creating turnovers. And then you add one of the best in terms of steals in the country from a year ago. There's only one direction to go, so yes, that will generate more steals than a year ago.
Yeah, 11 steals, I think it was, in that scrimmage. Now, that's against Warner Pacific, but Elisa Mavius is the player that you're referencing, and she's somebody that they like to sort of help that turnaround. Now, not having Shea in there to block shots and affect shots, that's huge. So that's a layer to what you're talking about in terms of the defense. I
just don't see them suddenly becoming a team that's going to be in the top 10 in fouls per game. And winning games, 64-58. I just don't see that being the way that this is built. Nor I'm not suggesting that it should be, but when you hear things like they're going to play with a certain level of grit on defense, I think that's where there was a major disconnect a year ago, where they really needed to play that way because they didn't have the talent to do otherwise, and didn't get the results. On the men's side, First, the battle of perception issue here. Yes, there are a couple of guys with some injuries. No, these injuries are not believed to be major, significant, or all that long term. But no, Supreme Cook is not going to play in the opener, and Des Lindsay isn't going to play in the opener. And in fact, they're probably going to miss a little bit beyond that. Exactly how long? Time will tell. But Cook's at least going through some things practice-wise. Lindsay, the shoulder injury, the significance of it, as of late last week, was still being evaluated to determine exactly. But two things. The automatic, and I realize the last several years has bordering on traumatized some fans into a feeling of that it wouldn't be an Oregon men's basketball season without a list of injuries. But perspective. Cook's going through some things in practice. It's not going to be long term. And yeah, this is a team that doesn't have a lot by way of size. So yeah, Nate Biddle is going to be a guy who's dealt with his own injuries for that matter. Your lone center, your lone true center for a while, and Cook will not be a true center, but he's going to play the 5 at times and what have you. But he'll get back. And for most, especially casual fans, you're not paying attention to men's college basketball in November and maybe not even into December anyway. So by the time he comes back, you wouldn't have even known he was gone. As for Des Lindsay, we'll find out the severity. I'm not sure, again, as of last week, I'm not sure even the program knew exactly the extent of the severity, other than he had been dealing with it for some time. Also, context. This is a junior college transfer who is going to be in a rotational capacity. You're not talking about a guy who's expected to play 38 minutes a game. You feel for the young men that they're going through some injuries, but the idea that, like, everybody's flying off the handle about, oh, it's another season and already this guy's hurt and this and that. Holy smokes. Like,
it's part of the game, and they're in such a better position, as you've noted, than they have in recent years. And Dana's excited about that. You can tell.
And they should be. All right, yeah, is there a lack of depth by way of lack of size of 6'10 plus guys? Yes, there is. But that can be said about a lot of teams in the country, first off. Second off, they have enough depth on the wings to where they're going to play a certain style anyway. And they're not shifting away from that style. Dana said it weeks ago. They're going to get back to playing the way that they had played. They are a deeper team. They have a full roster in terms of scholarship allotment for the first time in years. They are deeper. They are more talented. They're built a different kind of way. They may not have a truly radically gifted by way of absolute lottery pick level player. They may not. They may not have a drafted player, quite frankly, because in case y'all forgot, there's only like 64 guys who can fit that criterion. You can have plenty of really good college basketball players without being drafted into the NBA. Oregon's had some of those guys who've been undrafted free agents, and they hang around longer than some guys who get drafted, quite frankly. So, big deal. Biddle might be at the top of that list in terms of draftability. But regardless, they've got depth. They've got talent. They're built on the wings. Yes, an influx of transfers like many programs. And also some prominent guys coming back. Biddle among them. Bartholomew in the role that he has at guard. Obviously Shellstad. And Kwame. And to say nothing of Mookie Cook coming off an injury. They've got depth. Really across the board. The only spot where they're thin by way of number is, yes, at center. So that's where Supreme Cook's present injury comes into play. But do I think that that's going to be a factor against either UC Riverside or Montana? No. No, I do not. Or Portland, for that matter, into next week? No. And then, frankly, by the time they get around to after a couple of more games, you'll find out exactly how long somebody like Supreme Cook will be out. I'm not saying he's absolutely going to be available for the games in Las Vegas in a couple of weeks or not. I don't know. But the idea that, like, this team is already ravaged by injury or something, I mean, slow down. Sorry. No, that's just not the case. Especially since these were issues that have been known for some time. Didn't just suddenly pop up last Wednesday. Elsewhere, and how they've been practicing and who they've got around them by way of pieces to build around. Yeah, the transfers that they added, they may not have added one of the top 5 or top 10, but they added a whole lot within the top 50. In particular, a guy like Brandon Angel, who Oregon fans obviously saw quite a bit of from Stanford, specifically, and TJ Bamba, who used to be at Washington State and then spent a year at Villanova. They've got guys who have plenty nice stat lines, been productive, who they've played against and know exactly what they're getting. And when you add players like that around Shellstad, Biddle, Evans, to say nothing of one of the other transfers they had, and Raheem Moss from Toledo, who's a really productive player. Obviously, Bam Tracy coming back as well. You already got, I'm rattling off names. You're already talking about a rotation that's legitimately 8, 9, 10 deep before we're even talking about the guys who are hurt. So that's the other part of the context where I say, like, everything in perspective. This is a deeper team that was going to play significant rotations anyway, including with Shellstad, who, look, Dana was quite forthright, and so was Jackson. They need him to do more on defense, and that's not necessarily knocking Jackson from a year ago. They couldn't afford to ask him to play certain ways defensively because if he got in foul trouble, he had nobody to turn to. Once Bartholomew went down, it just became about you had to keep Jackson on the floor, so you can't really ask him to play hyper-aggressive on defense. Now, they can say, go ahead, have at it. Because Bartholomew's back, and he's healthy, and he's in a good spot, and frankly, there's other guys. So they can afford to play, particularly on the defensive end, virtually across the board, awfully aggressively. And that is something that, historically speaking, had certainly been a stronger piece of Dana Altman's teams. And in the postseason, it certainly started to shine through over the years. But you didn't really see it from last year's team as much, even at times in the postseason, because they couldn't afford it. Because they barely had 5 guys they could put on the court. Yeah, well, there'll be questions about exactly what the identity will look like when you lose Dante and Kuznart. Of course. But that's what November and December is going to be for, sorting out all of that. And everybody, Dana and the players, everybody talked about how they're not the biggest, strongest, fastest, but chemistry-wise, depth-wise, overall talent, they feel will be kind of the hallmarks of it, particularly on the defensive end. And that it's not going to look perfect immediately. It is going to take time, in part because of the influx of transfers, in part because that's just the nature of the game. So if you expect them to look like a finished product here against Riverside again, or Montana, or Portland, or you name it, no, they won't. They won't. And I wouldn't automatically chalk it up to it's just going to be another Dana season where things start suddenly clicking in February and March, and now they're off into the races. It could very well be before that. But, like I said, just perspective, folks. You don't have to fly off the handle about a couple of guys who are dealing with injuries, particularly since one of them is practicing, albeit maybe not in a full contact capacity. But, this is a much deeper team than it has been, especially compared to last season, where by the end of the season, they were down to what they were down to by way of numbers. This isn't that team. And it's not like the teams for the prior couple of years before that either. Are they as good on paper as the 1920 team was? I don't know. That I don't know. Maybe not. That team was awfully good. But this team does have talent. It does have depth. And I think it's going to showcase that starting, yes, with tonight's season opener against Riverside. And then in the weeks ahead. But ultimately, the Vegas games will be the ones that we get into more because power conference opponents and caliber games and those things. And on the women's side, some of those non-conference games, particularly Baylor, coming up very quickly. We'll get into that and Auburn and some of the other non-conference games that are of greater ilk. We'll get into in the weeks ahead. But so if you've got questions about either the playoff rankings and all the things related to football, you can certainly chime in with those. And yes, now the basketball season is upon us. You can chime in with those as well. And remind folks, Ryan, how and where they can send those to your weekly mailbags and the rest. Indeed.
So Ryan T. Clark on Twitter and then rclark@oregonian.com for email. Any questions regarding football, basketball, whatever's going on. I'm obviously focusing more on the women's basketball side, so I'll be able to speak more to that this season. But any and all things Duck related, send them my way, and I'm happy to answer them this week.
And with that, we will bid you adieu this week, and we'll see you next week with a recap of the game with Maryland, a look at, I'm not sure how much of a look back we'll do on the initial playoff rankings, but probably look ahead to the second one, along with a couple of basketball games on both fronts as well. So with that, we will bid you adieu, and we will see you next week.